Some people have access to wheelchair specifically customized to their needs. Other people are denied the use of a wheelchair because they're not considered disabled enough according to their insurance requirements. Some people are full-time wheelchair users, while others do not use them on a regular basis. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not because I use a wheelchair that I don't consider myself as a pedestrian. And I think it's important to recognize that wheelchair users in many cases use the term walking to describe how they move in the world. And I do, well, less now that I'm trying to talk about wheeling. I suggest that walking and wheeling should not be seen as in a binary opposition. Wheeling can be taught as a mobile practice, falling under the umbrella that covers a variety of walking practices. This challenged the ableist conceptions of walking that have prevailed in walking studies so far. To think about wheeling is to think about marginalized way of moving in the world. To consider wheelchair users as pedestrians is to reject the idea that walkers represent only the self-sufficient individual body. And Tim Quessel coined the term prosthetic citizens to reveal this relation with body and the material world, and makes me think also about the presentation that Ole gave yesterday about those assemblages between, materialities and body. I think that disability is a really good illustration of that. So how much time do I have left? 5 minutes? Oh, okay. Okay. So just briefly about my experience in New York. Well, it has been a challenge, of course, just to be in New York, to find an accessible apartment that was not too expensive. So I found something accessible, but that was expensive. And of course, like I wanted to, because I was interviewing disabled people, not necessarily wheelchair users, but obviously because I am a wheelchair user, I tend to attract more wheelchair users. It's just how it works. And I wanted to make things, as easy as possible for my participants, as we all, I guess, try to do. So I would try to meet them where they wanted me to meet. But that was also an issue for me because even myself, I cannot use all public transportation. And just maybe a short story about the first person who contacted me to participate, to meet me for an interview. It was over email, and that person quickly assumed that I was not using a wheelchair. It was not written in my call for participants that the researcher was a wheelchair user herself, and that person was blind too. So if maybe she had Googled me in Google Image, maybe that was not that obvious for her. So she was like, okay, let's meet at this place in my neighborhood. I know how to get there. Because for her as a blind person, she's familiar with certain spaces. This is in those spaces that she's independent. So I was like, okay, but now I had to come out, and say, is it wheelchair accessible? And then she was like, oh, I don't know. I've never thought about it. And then we start having this conversation about, disability, discrimination, and just over email before we even met. And maybe just a few words about how I do those interviews. So I have 2 microphones. I also use a GoPro camera that I attach to my wheelchair. If the other person is also a wheelchair user, I propose her to also put a camera on her wheelchair if she wants. And the emergence of mobile technology for me enabled me to do that research that I would not be able to do otherwise by myself. And this is also a very interesting thing that I've noticed, that it's extremely important for me to be able to do it all by myself. But just like in some ways it's so ableist too, that idea that you have to be, self-sufficient, and that technology offers that to some disabled people. And then all these issues of time and weather, of course. It wasn't during the fall. It started getting cold, so setting up the camera was becoming more difficult for my fingers because it would just froze. I had to ask for assistance to a stranger on the streets to help me to set up the camera. So that was also extremely interesting. Yeah, so basically it was really just asking people, let's go wherever you want me to go with you. At the beginning, I wanted to map like places where people feel like they belong or they don't belong. And while I started doing my interviews, I realized that just the act of moving together was something extremely interesting. Yeah, so maybe now I can show a short clip because I guess I'm running out of time. Okay. And maybe I can just read a quote while Monica is saving me. It's an interview I did with Park McCarter. She's an artist and disability justice activist in New York. And I think that interview really helped me to change my perspective on my own research, because she talked about how wheeling was an empowering act for her. So here she says, I also just like being really good at, navigating and being able to trust myself on that level. That's really nice. Navigating New York and seeing a lot of different reactions, it made me feel more, I guess entitled is a pretty shitty word, but it made me feel certainly more secure in taking up of the space. I don't feel big or monstrous. That really feels like their problem. And there are a lot of times in my life when I feel like it's my problem. I internalize it. Moving in space that often just really feels like their problem. Not in store, not inside. It's mostly outside, actually.
I'm not sure I can do this.
So you should share the screen. The screens are not shared.
Yeah. But I've done it, I think.
Thank you.
Maybe.
The sound is good. Yeah. Yeah, so that's just a snapshot, but I have many more videos on my website if you want to visit.